At first, I thought it was just a new home. I didn't know it was a cage. This is not a story about violence. It is a story about what silence does to a person. There are houses that protect you, and there are houses that slowly erase you. When I first walked into his, I had no way of knowing what kind of life I was stepping into. I stood at the threshold that first afternoon, my suitcase beside me, the autumn light filtering through windows I did not yet know how to open. Everything smelled unfamiliar, a combination of furniture polish and something else I couldn't name. A masculine stillness, a life that had existed for years without me, and now I was meant to fit inside it. The air itself felt different, denser somehow, as if the house had its own atmosphere that I would need to learn to breathe. At first, I told myself it was only strange because it was new. New walls that I traced with my fingertips, wondering if they would ever feel like mine, wondering if a day would come when I could move through these rooms without feeling like an intruder. New routines that I memorized like a student learning a foreign language, each one a small test I hoped to pass, each one bringing me closer to or further from some standard of acceptability I couldn't quite define. New silences that settled between us at the dinner table, in the hallway, in the bedroom, silences I tried to fill with questions, with laughter, with anything that might make the space between us feel less vast, less permanent, less like a chasm that would only grow wider with time. I told myself every woman feels like a guest in her own marriage at the beginning. My mother had warned me about this, hadn't she? That marriage takes time, that comfort comes slowly, that love is not always what it looks like in the movies or the magazines. I repeated these words to myself on the nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to him breathe beside me, wondering why I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. I told myself I would grow into it. Like a dress that's slightly too big, or shoes that need breaking in. I would adjust. I would adapt. I would become the woman who belonged in this house, who moved through these rooms with confidence, who knew without asking where everything was supposed to be. The house was neat. Too neat. Everything had a place, and every place already had a rule. The coffee mugs faced left in the cabinet. The remote control went on the right side of the coffee table, never the left. The bath towels were folded into thirds, not halves, and stacked with the open edge facing inward. These were things I learned slowly, through gentle corrections that felt, at first, like helpful guidance. I learned those rules quietly, the way a child learns not to touch a hot stove, not through explanation, but through the slight wince of disapproval, the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, the way he would wordlessly redo what I had just done, demonstrating the correct method without ever saying I had done it wrong. Where the shoes should be kept, in the closet by the door, never in the bedroom. Where the towels should be folded, in precise thirds, edges aligned perfectly. What time dinner should be ready, 6:30, not 6:45, and certainly not 7. What kind of food he liked, bland, predictable, the same rotation of meals his mother had made. What kind of food he did not touch, anything too spicy, too unfamiliar, too much like the food I had grown up eating and loving. At first, he said thank you. I remember those words. I held onto them like small treasures, evidence that I was doing something right, that I was becoming the wife he needed. Thank you for dinner. Thank you for ironing my shirts. Thank you. As if I were a service he was paying for, and he was a customer who believed in politeness. Then he stopped. The thank yous disappeared so gradually I didn't notice at first. 1 week they were there, the next week there were fewer, and then one day I realized it had been months since I'd heard those 2 words. The silence where gratitude used to be grew larger, until it became the norm, until I stopped expecting it, until I began to feel foolish for ever needing it in the first place. He never shouted in the beginning. That came later, when the walls had grown more familiar, when the newness had worn off and the real marriage, the daily grinding reality of 2 people learning they did not fit together, began to reveal itself. At first, he corrected, softly, calmly, with a voice that made it sound like he was doing me a favor. Like he was a teacher and I was a student who had so much to learn, and wasn't I lucky to have someone so patient to guide me? You're using too much oil. He said it while standing in the kitchen doorway, watching me cook, his arms crossed over his chest. Not angry, just observing, just correcting. This soup is too salty. He said it after 1 spoonful, pushing the bowl slightly away, not meeting my eyes. Why would you arrange the living room like that? He said it standing in the center of the room I had spent all afternoon rearranging, trying to make it feel more like a home, more like a place where people lived and laughed instead of just existed. They were small things, harmless things, the kind of things that, when I tried to explain them later to my mother on the phone, sounded absurd. What was I complaining about? That he had preferences, that he noticed details, that he cared about his home. I told myself marriage was compromise. Isn't that what everyone said? That marriage was give and take, and perhaps I had been too selfish, too rigid in my own ways. Perhaps this was what growing up meant. Learning to bend, learning to accommodate, learning that love sometimes meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I stopped cooking the way I liked, with bold flavors and spices that reminded me of my mother's kitchen, of Sunday dinners with my family, of a time when food was joy and not judgment, and started cooking the way he preferred. Bland chicken, boiled vegetables, potatoes without seasoning, rice that tasted like nothing. I stopped arranging the house the way I found beautiful, with colors and textures and small objects I had collected over the years, things that told the story of who I was, and started arranging it the way he found acceptable. Minimalist, neutral, clean lines, nothing personal, nothing that revealed too much. Slowly, without realizing it, I stopped asking myself what I wanted. The question itself began to feel selfish, indulgent, inappropriate. What I wanted became irrelevant in the face of what he needed, what he expected, what would keep the peace. I learned to anticipate his moods, his preferences, his unspoken demands. I became fluent in the language of his dissatisfaction, able to read in the set of his shoulders or the tone of his greeting whether the evening would be calm or tense. He left early for work every morning, always perfectly dressed, his tie knotted just so, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Always in a hurry, grabbing his briefcase, his keys, barely pausing to acknowledge my goodbye. He came back in the evenings tired and quiet, the energy drained from his face, his movements slow and deliberate. He would drop his briefcase by the door, always in the same spot, and walk to the bedroom to change, and I would wait, holding my breath, trying to gauge from the sound of his footsteps what kind of mood he was in. Sometimes he ate, sitting at the table in silence, methodically working through his plate. Sometimes he didn't, pushing the food around with his fork, his face a mask of disappointment I was not allowed to ask about. Sometimes he spoke, brief updates about work, complaints about traffic, observations about the news, words that felt more like obligations than conversations. Mostly, he watched. He watched me move through the house. He watched me serve dinner. He watched me clean. And in his watching, I felt myself becoming smaller, more careful, more conscious of every movement, every word, every breath. At first, I told myself he was just a quiet man. Some men are like that, aren't they? Reserved, thoughtful. Not everyone needs to fill the air with constant chatter. I had known quiet men before. My father was quiet, my uncle was quiet, and I had always found something peaceful in their silence. But quietness and absence are not the same thing. My father's quietness was a fullness, a presence. Even when he wasn't speaking, you could feel him there, solid and steady, a foundation you could lean against. His silence was companionship. This was different. This silence was a void, an emptiness, a sense that even when he was sitting 3 feet away from me, he was actually somewhere else entirely, and I was alone in the room with the ghost of him. I tried to make friends in the neighborhood. There were other women, wives, mothers, women who smiled at me over the fence, who invited me to coffee mornings and book clubs. I wanted desperately to say yes, to have somewhere to go, someone to talk to, a life that extended beyond these 4 walls. He didn't forbid it. That would have been too obvious, too crude. He was smarter than that. He just made it uncomfortable. "Why do you need friends?" he asked one evening, without looking up from his newspaper, the pages rustling in the silence between us. "Isn't this house enough for you?" I laughed, because I thought he was joking. Because surely no one could seriously ask such a question. Because the alternative, that he meant it, that he truly believed a house could replace human connection, was too absurd to consider. But he wasn't joking. His face, when he finally looked up, was serious. Almost hurt. As if my desire for friendship was a betrayal, proof that he was not enough, that I was ungrateful for everything he had given me. So I stayed home more. I stopped accepting invitations. I stopped waving quite as enthusiastically at the neighbors. I learned to make excuses that sounded believable. "I'm busy. I have things to do. Maybe next time." I wrote to my friends in Chicago less. Those letters that used to bring me such joy, filling pages with observations and jokes and the small details of daily life that felt worth sharing. I called them less. Those long phone conversations that used to stretch into the evening, where we'd laugh and reminisce and remind each other of who we used to be. Not because he told me to stop, but because every time I mentioned them, his face changed, just a little, just enough for me to notice. A tightening around his mouth. A coldness in his eyes. A shift in the atmosphere that told me I had said something wrong, crossed some invisible line. And I learned something about myself that year, something I'm not proud of. I was very good at avoiding conflict. I could sense it coming from a mile away, that tension gathering in the air like a storm cloud, and I would do anything, say anything, become anything, to make it dissipate. I became an expert at smoothing things over, at backing down, at swallowing my own needs and desires if it meant keeping the peace. The first year passed quietly, in this strange dance of accommodation and disappearance. The seasons changed outside the windows, autumn to winter to spring to summer, and I watched them from inside the house that was slowly becoming my entire world. People started asking questions. His mother, mostly, with her sharp eyes and her expectations she wore like armor. Any news? I smiled, practicing the expression in my mind before I spoke. Not yet. The second year passed, and the questions became more frequent, more pointed, weighted with an implication I was supposed to understand. The smiles became tighter, mine and theirs, stretched across faces like masks we all agreed to wear. The questions became more careful, wrapped in euphemisms and meaningful glances. Taking your time, enjoying married life. No rush, of course. But we all knew what they really meant. By the third year, even his mother started sighing too loudly when she visited. Those theatrical sighs meant to communicate what words could not, or should not, say directly. Children don't come from air, she said once, staring at me over her glasses, her voice sharp with implication. As if I didn't know. As if I hadn't been trying. As if the failure was mine alone to carry. I felt the shame burn in my chest, hot and acidic, spreading through my ribs like poison. But I said nothing. What could I say? That we had been trying. That I had been praying. That every month brought hope and then disappointment. That the sight of my own blood had become a source of grief. These were not things you said to his mother. These were not things you said to anyone. So I stayed silent, and let her think what she wanted to think. And just when I thought the house could not grow colder, something else happened. If you want to hear how this story continues, and what happened after this, you can subscribe and stay with me on the Quiet Voice Diaries.